So the first big patch since the release of Build 42 on December 17th has dropped, and it is packed full of fixes, changes, and even some new additions. Now, when I say this is a big patch, I'm really not exaggerating. In fact, it's almost 500 lines of new stuff. For anyone wondering why we haven't had an update until now, this is why. I won't be able to cover every single thing in this video because I'd be at it for hours, but what I can do is give you guys a digestible summary of the biggest things you need to know about from the patch notes so that you don't have to spend all that time filtering through lines of text. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to drop it a like and subscribe for more tips, guides, gameplay, and updates about Project Zomboid. Link in the description to the full patch notes if you want to give them a read for yourself. Okay, so where to start? Well, Build 42 is an unstable branch, and as such, there are always going to be bugs and issues associated with the release. The largest segment of these patch notes is thus based around fixes that you'll see in this update, and boy has the team been busy. So let's get into some of the biggest ones right off the bat. I know a whole bunch of people were struggling with actually launching the game on some AMD graphics cards, and if this is one of you, you'll be happy to know that the team has fixed the game black screening after clicking click to start. Now, whether this is fixed on all AMD graphics cards isn't specified, so if any of you are having the same problem after this release, let me know down in the comments and I'll get this across to the developers as soon as I can. Now, I know there's been a few pesky bugs that the community has been quite vocal about in the last few weeks, and at the top of that list is probably the inability to wash bandages and rags directly from a sink. Contrary to what some people have been saying, this was never an intended change based on the crafting menu or anything of that sort, and has now been fixed with this update. You'll be able to clean bandages, rags, denim strips, and leather strips too, as you were previously in Build 41. This was down to a missing tag on these items called "can be washed" that highlights the item as something that can be cleaned at a running water source. For anyone that has also tried packing up rags with the new crafting recipes, you'll also find that this no longer turns them into dirty rags when doing so. This has now been fixed. While we're touching on cleaning bandages, you should also know that some issues with boiling water to disinfect rags have now been fixed, including making sure that more containers like saucepans allow water to be boiled. So you should be able to do this without too much issue now in the new update. The speed at which you boil water has also been increased by 10 times the current value, making it a much faster process. And lastly, bottles of disinfectant will no longer consume the entire bottle on the first use and will act as intended to allow for multiple uses. Now, some of the most prominent issues that came up after Build 42 launched were around the use of consumable items that have certain drainable attributes, such as batteries or welding torches. Specifically, drainable items like car batteries or the handheld batteries you'd put into flashlights would experience an issue that caused them to reduce to 16% of their maximum charge when saving and reloading games. Thankfully, this has now been fixed in this update and will no longer need mods to solve these problems, alongside another fix to a bug that was causing players to be unable to insert batteries into flashlights that had been favorited. So batteries will no longer lose charge, and more importantly, for those that have been trying to grind out welding and metalworking skills, you can now refill empty welding torches as intended with propane tanks, which wasn't functioning correctly previously. Those of you that have instead been dabbling with farming have likely experienced some of your crops withering and dying with seemingly no reason behind it. According to the patch notes, the devs have now fixed an error where a plant's bad month would be offset forward by 1 month by mistake. This would then incorrectly flag that plant with the cursed tag and cause it to rot. So all being well, farming will go back to working as it should, and we'll be able to grow crops without issues as long as we avoid that singular bad month for planting. Now, aside from the big fix to crops, there were a few seed packets that were not able to be opened previously, which will now function as intended. Watering cans were also not filling up when placed in the rain, which is now no longer the case in the new update, and they fill up just as any other container would. One of the biggest things to come to Project Zomboid in Build 42 was the implementation of basements, whether that was the sprawling underground complexes we've seen attached to certain points of interest, or the ones you'd find at random underneath residential homes, and just about everything in between. I think it's safe to say that many of us were looking forward to using these basements as potential safe houses, but unfortunately one big issue was that generators refused to power basements below ground level. That has now been fixed in this update, and you'll be able to make any basement your post-apocalypse haven. Previously, generators would also not power anything above elevation level 8, and this has now been fixed also, but it's not been specified how high this stretches in terms of distance. I'd assume maybe to the maximum elevation available, but I guess we'll see soon enough after players get testing the update. While we're touching on generators, there were also some issues putting these on empty car seats, which have now been fixed. Several problems surrounding skill books have been fixed in this new update as well. For example, reading the Longblade skill book will now no longer grant reloading skill incorrectly and has been righted to grant you the skill you'd expect. There's also been a fix to both the missing maintenance books and maintenance not giving you the same experience multiplier that every other skill book did. Lastly, and this is a much smaller one, an issue with the recipe for packing up the pottery skill books has been fixed. So I think that almost covers most of the major fixes that we've seen from this patch, but there are some additional ones in regards to crafting specifically. To go over all that would leave me talking at you for hours or just listing them all off, which would probably bore you to death, but the big ones include multiple fixes to welded weapon crafting, a fix to ensure the crafting panel acknowledges selected categories when using the search bar, and a fix for name tags sticking to the cursor when minimizing the crafting menu. The only large issue that I know hasn't been fixed quite yet that I did feel was important to make a note of was rain collectors not being able to be connected to sinks. Hopefully we get a resolution for that in the not too distant future, and I know the devs are working towards it. As I mentioned in the intro, if you're looking for anything specific, there's a link in the description to the patch notes themselves. For now, we're moving on to brand new additions to the game with this update. Keep in mind that this was primarily a hotfix patch, but there are still some new things to be excited about, so let's dig into those now. So first and foremost, good news for all the foraging enjoyers out there. Several new books, recipes, magazines, and crafting tools have been added to the foraging tables. The developers made a special note here that this especially included certain bottleneck items that prevent the player from progressing further, so I'd hazard a guess that it will be worth spending some time foraging from here, and if you're looking to either get into new crafting skills or are just looking to prepare for the long term as soon as possible, it is something that is worth your time. Similar additions have been made to the randomized world stories you'll find while wandering around. Speaking of crafting skills, there are a bunch of new recipes that have been added. Those that have been playing Build 42 already will know that we are missing a lot of the intended crafting update right now, and if you weren't aware already, we're going to see several updates to this during the time Build 42 is on the unstable branch, this being the first of many. There are now recipes for carving short bats, which are required for spike clubs and mace crafting. You will also now be able to forge buckles with the blacksmithing skill, as well as spiked baseball bats and cudgels. This isn't the only thing that has been added to blacksmithing though, with other recipes added for small iron bands, regular iron bands, mace heads, spiked clubs, spearheads, long spearheads, large hooks, and what is referred to as a handguard dagger, which I'll be interested to see in game. Sort of makes me think of a hidden assassin's blade, but I really don't know for sure. In other areas of crafting, we'll now be able to split circular saw blades in half, which can then be used to make certain weapons. There is now a recipe for a carved wooden bucket item, which I'd imagine is going to be very useful for those that are keeping their own livestock and looking to collect milk from their cows, for example. We'll be able to make twine from dogbane now. We can fix saws or saw blades with a file. We can scavenge long sticks from brooms or mops going forward. And lastly, we can break down a set of regular sized iron bands into 4 small iron bands. Oh, and before I forget, if you found any of the water purification tablets that were brought into the game with Build 42, there is now a functioning recipe for these where you can turn 1 liter of tainted water into clean drinking water. Now, moving away from crafting additions, let's take a look at some more general performance and customization stuff. We can now raise the UI render FPS cap to 120, with new options for both 60 and 120 FPS. 60 FPS is now the default. As for customization, if you've not been a fan of the current discomfort system that has been brought to the game with Build 42, there is now an additional sandbox setting called Discomfort Modifier that can be used to disable, reduce, or increase increase the effect of discomfort based on your preferences. The only other sandbox option that has been added with this update is the ability to change the maximum hours of fuel that can be added to fires or stoves. Currently the default is 8 hours. This setting will allow that to be adjusted. Now, I've talked briefly about the discomfort modifier, and with that is of course a brand new Moodle, but the response around the Moodle design as a whole for Build 42 was very mixed, and probably not the resounding success that the developers were hoping for from the update. Some players felt that the new designs lacked that old Project Zomboid pixelated charm, and as such, these Moodles have now been updated again, with certain designs changed and all of them receiving a bit of pixelation to return them to the old style. Lastly, before we move on from new additions, there's been something big brought in for the gun nuts out there. There is now a new chance to damage sandbox option, which is an experimental new method to calculate firearms hits, which is now based on the chance to damage. This setting will be defaulted to being enabled in the new update, but the previous way of doing things is still available in the sandbox settings if you want to change back. The devs are welcoming feedback on this new feature, which aims to make firearms usage more enjoyable and eliminate those frustrating missed shots that we've been experiencing so far. Now, unfortunately, there is also some bad news for the firearms enthusiasts. Shotguns will now no longer grant as much XP to the aiming skill as they had before this update. They were giving XP based on the amount of pellets that hit in each shot. This has now been changed to only grant XP per shot as initially intended. I'm interested to see how all of these changes affect the grinding of aim skill, because before this update it was a real slog. Okay, so that brings me to the last segment of this video, and I think this is going to be a fairly long one again, but we're taking a look at balancing now. That's essentially existing stuff that has been changed. First and foremost, anyone that's experienced a comical death at the hands of a particularly vicious tree branch will be glad to know that scratches from this source will no longer bleed and lacerations have been removed. On the flip side, those of you that have been benefiting from the use of cola and soda cans to avoid the need for sleep will have to find some coffee instead, because the fatigue change from drinking soda has now been reduced from the current 5 to a value of 2. If you're like me and you've been building your own base in Build 42, you may have noticed that axes don't seem to reduce sharpness when chopping down trees, only when they are used in combat. With the new update, sharpness will now reduce when cutting down trees, and as such, it'll be more important to keep an eye out for tools that can be used to sharpen the blade once again. With that in mind, you'll probably be glad to know that whetstones and masonry chisels have had their spawns boosted as well, as being added to several new distribution tables, so we'll see them in a lot more places. Whetstones are crucial for sharpening blades if you haven't tried that yet, so they're incredibly important to look out for. Okay, now a couple of things to know about when it comes to animal husbandry as well. Up until now, one of the best ways to keep your character's weight in check was to use cows or sheep to make milk and then turn that into butter using a butter churner. Previously, it only required 0.5 liters of milk to produce butter, and you could find yourself with a whole lot of it very, very easily as a result. Now it will require 5 liters of milk per craft, so this definitely won't be the easy cheat code that it has been so far. However, that said, it is still incredibly easy to make, and even a single bar provides over 3,000 calories, which I haven't seen anything in regards to in these patch notes, so yeah, still useful, but not quite as broken as it was previously. If you were to decide to butcher your animals for cuts of meat instead, you'll now find that the nutritional gains for each cut of animal meat have been bumped up, and will hopefully be a bit more viable now. Now, moving over to take a look at some other skills, there have been several adjustments to experience gain. Maintenance XP has now been doubled, which will essentially mean that your weapons and tools will last longer as a result. Experience gain has been increased for several weapon craft recipes, which is something I haven't really dabbled with myself yet, but I'd imagine this will mostly impact things like blacksmithing. Many of the crafts associated with bones have had their XP gain increased as well. Lastly, several leather and hide crafting recipes have had their experience points increased as well. So that isn't everything when it comes to skills and crafting though. There is a whole bunch of changes, to be honest, that I doubt I'll be able to cover in full, but some of the crucial ones that I think will have a very big impact on the game are things like the addition of a recipe to nap large stones into smaller stones for experience training. I know some of the new skills have been incredibly difficult to learn in their current states because, well, they just aren't really finished, and this sort of thing will be aimed at making that a bit easier. Along similar lines, many masonry recipes now give experience points, with the developers developers noting that right now these values are mostly placeholders and will need some adjustment as time goes on alongside the actual recipes themselves. As an example, crushing limestone has been moved to the masonry category and now grants masonry XP. There is a new similar recipe that allows you to nap said limestone for experience in the napping skill. There is no skill requirement for either of these recipes, and the developers directly state in these patch notes that they can be used for grinding out experience points, since limestone can be found laying around on the ground. As for those that were finding muscle strain of the neck to be frustrating during the tailoring experience grind, this muscle strain has now been halved, so it should be easier to spend extended sessions gaining XP. Like I said earlier, there are a few other recipes that have been added. There are some that now have experience gains that didn't before, and I think generally speaking we'll see some of these skills that have been very difficult to level get just a little bit easier in this update, or at least we'll be able to actually grind out experience for them in a somewhat timely manner. So I think that's just about it from this video, but one last time I will say there is a link in the description to the full patch notes if you'd like to give them a read for yourself. There is a lot to go through, so keep that in mind. Now before I wrap this one up, I do just want to ask you guys, what would you say is the main thing from these patch notes that you're thankful has been added? And if you can think of something, what do you still think needs fixing as a priority? I know the developers are sifting through a massive amount of feedback and bug reports right now, and to help with that, they have also added a button on the main menu that opens up the bug report forum if you want to lend them a hand and weren't sure how to do so. Special thank you as always to my fantastic Patreon supporters for backing the channel for as little as £3 a month and joining our multiplayer Project Zomboid server, which will be moving to build 42 as soon as we're able to do so. Link in the description if you'd like to join them. Thanks everyone, and I will see you all in the next one.